this morning, and I want to thank Duncan Wood and the whole team of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute, really does a great job at keeping Mexico on the map here in Washington and making everyone, all of us here who observe and participate in the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship feel part of the team. So I want to commend the work they do and for putting together such a great event today. And I'd like to say good morning to 3 former ambassadors who I'm sure we'll have an engaging discussion with them today. It's quite a privilege to have the opportunity to speak with 3 people who've had such an impact on the relationship and who have served as ambassadors from the U.S. to Mexico at different points over the last 3 decades, which have really seen a sea change in the way Mexico and the U.S. relate to each other as neighbors. At a time, in the bilateral relationship when we are confronting challenges and deciding, okay, where do we go from here in what is a very complex relationship that encompasses economics, security, immigration, and culture. It's a great moment to kind of pause and figure out how we can strategize and make sure that we move forward in a productive way that is in benefit and produces a win-win situation for both countries, as Ambassador Jerónimo Gutierrez pointed out. So to get started, and I won't bother with bios, you'll excuse me, but I think you have all of the information in your packets. We'll start with introductory remarks, have a discussion, and then have a time for a few questions. So without further ado, I was going to start with Ambassador Jones, maybe start with reverse order in terms of time period of service. If you could kick us off with a few introductory comments on how you see the bilateral relationship moving forward.
Well, I think it's an inflection point that all of us have to be concerned about and aware of and active to make sure the outcome is a good one. The importance of this bilateral relationship cannot be overstated, and I want to thank the Wilson Center for putting on this conference, and I think others of like-minded nature need to be putting on conferences and energizing people who understand this relationship to get active and to get that point of view across. I guess the thing that's disappointing to me is that decades of distrust by the Mexicans and decades of dismissiveness by the Americans was melting, and we were developing a real relationship between our 2 countries and our 2 peoples. And most of that is due to the fact that NAFTA was passed, that Mexico took some reform efforts to open its economy, and really developing an attitude that the North American region was perhaps the luckiest, the most beneficial region in the entire world, starting with energy resources, people resources, et cetera, so that we were clearly the most competitive region in the world. But in order for us to realize the benefits of that, we had to understand and appreciate each other. And I think that's one of the biggest disappointments that I've found in the new administration coming in and gratuitously creating rifts between our 2 countries that just make it another hurdle that has to be passed. I've seen in my own lifetime the great progress between Mexico and the United States. I first went to Mexico when I was a young staffer for President Lyndon Johnson, who summoned me to the ranch and said, I want you to go to Mexico, and in 10 days we want to set up a trip, and I want 2 things you've got to make sure happens. Number 1, we get bigger crowds than JFK did in 1963. And number 2, that there are no demonstrations, because that was the beginning of the Vietnam demonstrations. Well, both of those things occurred, but it was enormously difficult to do it. The level of distrust among the Mexican people, the government toward the United States and our government was enormous. The language barriers were enormous. I don't believe I met anybody at that time who spoke any words of English in the top levels of government or business. I went back, been there in between, but in '93, going back as ambassador, it was a totally different country, a totally different, not totally different, but a greatly different attitude about the United States. And it set the stage by passing NAFTA, completing the negotiations under Ambassador Negroponte, and then I came in at the end of that. It set the stage for a mutual understanding. And that is exactly where we have been grown, because wealth has been created that benefits a lot of people, at least half the people in Mexico and a number of people in the United States, and that wealth is worth defending. And the problem is, in both countries, that wealth was not evenly dispersed and distributed. And therefore, we have great resistance in both countries to continuing on this path. So I think that our job basically is to really outline the benefits of the bilateral relationship, both from a standpoint of the economy as well as our own national security in both countries. I thought Ambassador Gutierrez analyzed the situation perfectly, and I think we can take it from there.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Jones. I think many of us feel the same way, that so much was done to kind of improve this relationship and cultivate it, that it's hard to see it at such a difficult moment. And so I will pass the word to Ambassador Davido, who wrote a book about the complexities of the of the bilateral relationship and Puerto Espín. So if you could offer your thoughts on how you see things moving forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. I find so much of what is said by Jim and by others, by Ambassador Gutierrez, reminds me of an experience. I'm at the age where I'm reminded more of the past than the future, but back in grad school, I was in a seminar, and there was a student in the seminar who offered some thoughts. I won't say who the student was because I don't want to embarrass myself. And the professor said, well, let me take what you have said and elevate it to a point where we can all discuss it. And to a degree, that's what we are all doing. We are dealing with words and ideas that emanating from the administration, which are at best inchoate, largely based on misperception, lack of understanding, a lack of clarity, and in some cases just simple prejudice. And I think it's important that as we do what the professor did, what we all do, everyone in this room, as part of our lives, that is bring hard analysis and thinking to this issue, that we don't forget what the genesis of this all is. And the genesis is, in my view, essentially pretty ugly. Now, I just had to say that, and I think I said it in about as elegant a way as I could.
Very good.
Without descending into what I really want to say. Okay? Now, I think all of us understand and share the perception of Jim and the ambassador that the best approach to what we are confronting is to educate and illuminate the American public as to the totality of the relationship and how very important it is to us. And that's what we're doing today, although nobody in this room needs to be illuminated or educated about this. But certainly there's a lot of work that has to be done. And we have to stress the nature of the relationship in both its economic, its cultural, its security components. And the Mexican government clearly understands this. Ambassador Gutierrez told us that that's one of the things they're going to be doing. Now, let me just say, and I have said this to some others, there is a danger that is inherent in this that I think the Mexican government understands and will try to avoid, but they are living in a political environment as well. The danger is this. If the basic argument is Mexico gives so much to the United States by way of cooperation in trade, in security, in anti-narcotics cooperation, it would be a great mistake, and we are seeing this develop among some Mexican politicians, to argue that if things go in the wrong direction, particularly in terms of trade, that kind of cooperation that we're talking about in security, in counterterrorism, in anti-narcotics, that will tend to disappear. And so what should be an explanation of the great benefits of the relationship can be turned in such a way by rhetoric to seem to be a threat, a negotiating threat. I don't know if I'm making myself that clear, but this is something that has to be carefully handled by the Mexican government and by its friends or the friends of the relationship here in the United States. Another point that I want to make, I think we've all experienced and seen that when confronted with trade disputes in the past and even presently, the Mexican government has been very competent in determining the pressure points in the United States. I am sure that the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Trade has already put together its very detailed mapping of the United States, congressional district by congressional district. And they are absolutely right in doing this. And their point of pressure on individual congressmen and senators has got to be based upon the economic interests of those districts. I think when all is said and done, this will be the last thing I'll say is that for all that we may believe and think and talk about the benefit of the bilateral relationship and its many facets to both countries, indeed to all three countries, but particularly to the United States as we go about talking to other people. Notwithstanding that, I think this will come down to money and economic factors. And to the degree that the Mexicans and their allies can point to the damage that individual Americans and congressional districts will suffer by an abrupt change will be very important. So let me stop there and we can get into more details.
Very good, thank you, and thank you for that very diplomatic introduction. It is difficult to talk about this without.
You don't know how hard it was.
Oh, but believe me, I struggle with it every day. For those of us who are observers of Mexico, it's impossible to know Mexico and not love Mexico. So it's been a trying period. It's a pleasure to pass the microphone to Ambassador Wayne. I had the privilege of meeting all of these gentlemen when they were ambassadors in Mexico, and Ambassador Wayne was most recently there. So if you could provide your thoughts.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim, for so eloquently setting the stage and laying out all the key issues. Let me just say that I share opinion, the same perspective as both of my colleagues. And but what I always like to say when I start off talking about Mexico is the one country in the world that touches the daily lives of more U.S. citizens than anywhere else. And it's so ironic that there is still such misunderstanding and that we fall into such differences of opinions about this. Just a little footnote, I worked a lot on Europe early on, and so I think about the French-German relationship and how that turned from being one of animosity and 5 wars in a short period of time, historically, relatively, into one of the pillars of unity and strength in Europe. And in a lot of ways, that's what my colleagues have been doing over the past 25 years with their Mexican counterparts, is turning this relationship between the United States and its southern neighbor into a pillar of strength for both countries and for the continent. And that is what is disturbing about recent months and what has happened in this relationship, because tremendous progress has been made over the past 25 years in putting that distrust and suspicion aside and actually doing good and hard things together. And as Ambassador Gutierrez said, it doesn't mean this is all easy. It's not easy. There are still tough issues out there in practically every area to work through, because we're both big countries. We have different perspectives. But the attitudes have increasingly become, okay, this is a big problem out there. Let's find a solution together that is indeed win-win, or that meets the criteria that is going to make it something positive for both sides. And we've been able to do that increasingly. And there is still an agenda that it's really important that we work on between the countries to do that. So it is, in all of our views, and certainly in my view, tremendously important that we move beyond the rhetoric and actually get down to the serious discussions of, okay, what are the concrete things that we think aren't going as well as they should, and let's work on those, because there is a lot that is going very well. And if you think about it, in each of these areas, there's just a tremendous amount of importance. As Jeff said, it comes down to money. In a sense, it comes down to the economy. There's $1 million a minute of trade between the two countries. There's tremendous foreign direct investment and investment in capital instruments on both sides of the border. The networks that produce things are tightly integrated. And NAFTA, as all of you have probably said, but I'm going to say it again, NAFTA gets the blame for things that aren't the fault of NAFTA. Every serious economic study has found that it's new technology, automation, and then maybe trade with China that has eliminated many, many more manufacturing jobs. But for the reasons we can all suspect, and I won't go into, it's easier to blame our southern neighbor for these kind of things than to really get down and look at what the solutions are. So there are ways to deal with these employment problems and solutions. They're going to be really hard, and they are not all in the trade area. In fact, a bunch of them are in domestic policy in the United States to actually help people keep new jobs as this world economy keeps going forward. And in NAFTA itself, we've actually created jobs, we've created wealth, and there are a lot of things we can do to make it better for the future. There's no doubt about that. As Geronimo Gutierrez said, it's an agreement that was written a long time ago. There's a lot we can do to make it better. So let's do that. Similarly, if we look at politics, at foreign policy, which we'll get to talk about a little bit later on, we share a lot of the same perspectives. Not everything, but there are a lot of good things we can do together. And most particularly, we can look to both of our southern neighbors in Central America, and they can use some support and help from us in dealing with some of the challenges that they have, and thus we'll benefit because it deals with people leaving those countries looking for better lives. Just one example. In the security area, we can't go into it right now in great detail, but there's been a tremendous step forward in the ability to dialogue and to work together between the two countries, both in law enforcement forces and in military-to-military talks. There's a lot more to do. There's no question about that. You just look at the opioid crisis in the United States and you look at the surging violence numbers from organized crime in Mexico, there's still a lot that we can do together if we're cooperating. But if we stop cooperating, we're going to eliminate a big chunk of the positive possibilities for tackling these problems. And then finally, just in the people-to-people area, when I went to Mexico, even after the great work of my two colleagues and others, we discovered there were only about 10,000 Mexicans studying in the United States. Can you imagine that? There are 100,000 Saudis, 250,000 Chinese, 10,000 Mexicans. A giant neighbor, and we just didn't have that human interaction in the way that you can build better understanding for the future. There's a lot of human interaction, and that has some good and some challenging aspects as we're working through. But we've got to work on that people-to-people, the sort of positive potential for the future in this relationship. Mexico is our neighbor, and as we started off saying, the United States is really blessed. It's got two neighbors that are oceans, one neighbor to the north that is very cooperative, has some of its own views too, a neighbor to the south that basically shares the same values that we do and is willing to cooperate on a whole bunch of issues. How many other great powers historically have had that kind of a situation to live and act in? Not too many. So we really, really need to take all the potential that is in this North American continent. And then finally, just to mention in that sense that, as Ambassador Gutierrez said, there's a big opportunity here, and that is to revitalize the common vision of what North America is. I'm not sure where this will come out, but as he was implicating, out of every crisis, there are opportunities if we can get it right. And if we can turn this crisis into something where we get a clearer sense of where we can go together, I personally believe as a common production platform for North America, there's a lot that all three countries can benefit for. If we can come out positively at the end of this difficult moment of working these issues through, that's going to really benefit the United States as well as our two neighbors. So let me stop there.
Great. Yeah, I think all of the ambassadors have emphasized how important the relationship is and how important it is that we are able to move forward in a positive vein. What can we do here in the U.S., as members of the private sector, think tanks, academia, to make sure that this moves in the proper direction? I mean, Ambassador Gutierrez spoke about misconceptions. Really, when you think about the last 23 years of NAFTA, there hasn't been a good enough job done in explaining the vital importance of Mexico to the general population in the U.S. Now we're under the gun, and we've got to figure out how we get the message out, in fairly short order. Is it possible? What can we do? What should we be doing? I know there's been some frustration in Mexico with the fact that the private sector in the U.S. could probably be a little bit more forward-leaning in terms of explaining how they benefit from this relationship. And that could probably be said writ large. But what can we do to get this message out and make sure that we have the best outcome possible?
Same order. I think in this new era of alternative facts, I think we have to double down and get the real facts out there. We have to quit talking to ourselves and start reaching out to those who have influence in our communities and get the real story out there. Amy is exactly right. It used to frustrate me that after NAFTA was passed and it was implemented rather well and it benefited both countries, but those who benefited never said anything about it. Those who voted against NAFTA in 1993 remained against it, same arguments, and they just kept pounding them and pounding them and pounding them. And we've seen here recently that if you just keep repeating something, even if it's totally wrong, it becomes believable by a large number of people. So I think we have to start telling the story. Second thing is I think it's hopefully we can take our president's tweeting ability away from him. But if not, I think our cabinet has to really be more sensitive about implementing the overall policies that the president stands for, and explaining how we can do that in a way that's that recognizes the partnership we have with Mexico. And I think on the Mexican side, one of the things that worried me about the time that Secretaries Kelly and Tillerson went down there, which I thought was a very successful trip, and I talked to a couple of Mexican cabinet people and a couple of Mexican business leaders. The comment was, "Who are we to believe?" Because a tweet sort of undercut what they had established in their visit in Mexico. And my point was, is as long as they're in the cabinet, I think you can believe them because they will implement in a sensitive way. It may not be what you would prefer, but at least it would recognize and respect you. What I discovered in Mexico on those visits was an overconfidence. I mean, obviously, a sense of being insulted, disrespected, anger, but that led to an overconfidence as to what they can do on their own without the United States. And I think that can lead to some very dangerous decisions on their part if that is not checked. So those are some of the things I worry about, but I do believe education is important. Jeff pointed out the importance of pointing out to every congressional district, or at least the key ones, what it means if NAFTA were to disappear or to change dramatically in a different direction. And I think that education, that's all of our responsibility.
Very good.
I would just make 2 points. First, I think there has been relatively less exposition and concern from the American business community over this issue than there should be, in a large measure because their eye has been taken off the ball by other possibilities that are being dangled by the administration, particularly tax reform. And I think what we have to fight against is this idea that these massive organizations that we all know that represent the American economy or the private sector are incapable of dealing with more than one issue at a time. They may think that, but I think it's important that we push and shove the NAFTA issue always to the front and not allow it to be forgotten as everyone focuses on capital gains cuts or other tax issues. And then finally, another thing that we should not forget, and I don't think anybody in this room can, is that there are other issues relating to Mexico and Mexicans which deserve our continued concern and support. The question of the wall is, it's an issue that I don't think we can spend too much time on in effort. But certainly the question of treatment of Mexican and other undocumented aliens in this country is absolutely critical. We can't allow our concern about NAFTA to dilute our real focus that should be directed to what is becoming in many parts a real human rights catastrophe.
Very good.
Well, clearly, as has been said many places in many different ways, we who live here in the swamp of Washington need to find a better way to get out and talk to people who live in other settings around the country. And it's not an easy thing to organize for us to do. But I just say I'm ready to go on the road and talk in some of these places to people. And we have to, just as Jeff was saying, there are a number of other really important issues, and we really have to get a discussion going as, well, what are the pros and cons of different approaches here? Have we really talked about what the pros and cons of a wall are and how it's going to benefit security or not? There's some places where it probably does. Other places doesn't make much sense at all. But there's not a really serious debate about that. Similarly with immigration and treatment of individuals. What we need to try and do, all of us, I'm going to say, is work hard to get those kind of serious discussions underway, because all these issues represent problems. They're problems that need serious solutions. And that's the same thing with employment in the United States. It's pretty clear that there are a lot of white males not working in the United States. Why aren't they working? That's a big problem for our society. So let's figure out what to do about it, not find short-term simple solutions that might make you feel good but don't really address the problem or get those people back in an active role in our societies and our economies. And so I think that's any tool that can get us really seriously discussing those issues all around the United States or in different parts of the United States is going to be really important.
Yeah, that's an important point, and I think a source of frustration for a lot of this that, of course, there are these issues of unemployment in certain pockets, particularly in the Rust Belt, but the solution to helping incorporate those people into the global economy is not going to be protectionism, no. So now that we have thought a little bit about what the U.S. can do and what we can do is from this side of the border, let's think about what might be some suggestions that we could provide our friends in Mexico in terms of how they should react to the situation. As we all know, there's a presidential election in June 2018. It's going to be very competitive. Already, it's really distracting the public discourse into what's going to happen next. You mentioned, Ambassador Davido, the issue of the wall, and it is uncomfortable to talk about it. But for Mexico, it's probably even more complex for them in a political context when you have a productive relationship and you're erecting a certain visible affront to a friendly neighbor. How can we help our Mexican colleagues get through this in political terms, so to speak? Who wants to take that one?
I'm sorry, I'm not very confident that we can. I think the wall has turned into an iconic issue for this administration. They're not going to back away from it. It's immensely insulting to Mexicans. We cannot underestimate it. I think the wall will probably fall under its own weight in one way or another as we figure out, the administration figures out just how expensive it will be and how much problems there will be environmentally and what have you in creating it. I don't mean to dismiss this as an important issue in any way. I do think that the other two issues that we've been talking about, that is commerce and the treatment of Mexican citizens in the United States, are infinitely more important and perhaps more remediable in some ways.
My sense is that until the rhetoric became too insulting, etc., that the wall was something the Mexicans would accept. They began to accept the fact that the United States had a right as a sovereign country to protect its borders. And I disagree with the fact that the wall will do anything necessarily to protect us. In some areas it will be a barrier that should be considered, but all across the border it makes no sense whatsoever. And if it is built, the history is going to look upon this as one of the great gaffes, one of the great misuse of public money. And what is really needed is an immigration bill in the United States that is realistic, that recognizes the labor needs we have in this country and has mechanisms to protect those who protect our borders in terms of those who want to come in illegally. I've said all along since I was there in Mexico, that if you really want to stop illegal immigration, you stop the job opportunities, and you go after the employers who flaunt the law in the United States. And that's never been done. It can be done, and we have the technical capability of really protecting the immigration and enforcing it. So I think Congress and the President, the number one thing for them is to have a realistic immigration bill. As far as what Mexico can do, I think so far Mexico has handled this situation rather well. From the left and the right, they have not exploited some of the things that I think they could have exploited. And if the political atmosphere in Mexico does not become much more intense in the wrong direction, I think they will continue to. What concerns me is that some of the candidates away from the center might exploit the political atmosphere in Mexico, created by us primarily, to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily have done had things been in a more normal relationship. So I think most of the responsibility is on our side to not poison the well in Mexico so that we can work our way through these very difficult problems. But I think that I'm cautiously optimistic that it can be done.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, that Mexico really has behaved like the adult in the room with a lot of maturity and reflection in terms of its responses to date. Would you like to comment? Or
Well, I agree with both of my colleagues that we can't be too careful about the effects of our words and actions in other places. It's not really too good for us to give advice to others as to how to negotiate, except remember your long-term interests. But what we can do is help our own colleagues understand the importance of not cornering those who you're negotiating with. And in the long term, these are going to be our partners, we hope. Yeah. And, you know, one of the things I've learned from being in many different negotiations is that it's really important to give your counterpart space and a path to get to agreement with you. Sometimes they might not take that path, but if you don't give them a path, you're certain that they're not going to take it. And I'm sure Carla Hills knows that from her many negotiations, and I think we just have to keep that in mind and keep reminding people here, if it looks like they've forgotten it, that's just a very key part of getting to yes, as has famously been said by an author from Harvard.
Very good. Duncan, do we have time for maybe 2 questions, or should we? Very quick questions, okay. Sir, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Raul Hinojosa, professor at UCLA. Where we're maintaining a 3,000 county database between Mexico and the United States, and I wanted your comment on results that we've come up with. We're calling it the Trump paradox. If you look at the 3,000 counties, 98% of the counties that voted for Trump actually have very few Mexicans, number one, and number two, very little interaction with Mexico in terms of trade. But here's the problem, that there is a big idea. There is the big idea of the wall, that and Sherman Robinson and I put the band back together to study the negative and positive economic impacts of various things. It turns out immigration, mass deportations, is much more serious than trade that would happen. So that's number one that has to be understood. The trade decline is also significant, but pales in comparison. The real question then is, how do we present a new, bigger idea, Jean Monnet's vision, right, for North America? Because I think that this is where we're at. We're at a moment where a paradox is, yes, we can have the the material basis for a strong argument of what we need to do something better. But I think the issue of bringing up migration, which has not been brought up a great deal so far, I think is part of the issue. California, where we're from, we're already in a sense establishing a new type of dialogue between California and Mexico that is based much more on these issues of human rights, vision of the future. Maybe that's part of the answer to the paradox.
Okay, great. One other question here up front.
Yes, thank you. Eric Hirschberg from American University. As I think about the issues that you all have addressed so clearly, and that the ambassador did in the first panel as well, I'm reminded of the efforts that we've been pursuing at our university to increase public understanding of the benefits of the bilateral relationship and of the North American integration dynamic more generally. And one of the ways that we've framed that is that our role as social scientists is to try to speak truth to power. But we've been entertaining the possibility that power just hangs up on us. And if that's the case, we could find ourselves dealing with the consequences of 4 years of provocative and destructive comments and actions from an American administration. What most worries you about what the bilateral relationship will look like and what will need to be repaired for many years subsequent if we don't see an improvement in the discourse coming from this administration?
Okay, so I think generally attending the question of immigration and then what most worries you. Do you all want to take it, or does someone in particular want to raise their hand?
I think the big idea is North American regional economy. That is a big idea that can benefit all three countries, and I think that has to be packaged. But before it can be packaged, I think we do have to, as Tony said, we have to deal with the folks who drove this last election, white males and others who are employed, quite frankly, but who are scared of the future. And they're scared of the future because they see their opportunities and their kids' opportunities diminished because of social advances. More women in the workforce, more immigrants in the workforce, et cetera. And so I think we have to address that from the U.S. point of view to have a stronger body politic and a more enlightened body politic in the United States. So that's the thing that worries me most, is that we're not going to really address the driving force behind the political election in this year or last year, and what could be in the future. And if we don't, I think we could continue to make horrible mistakes that will have consequences for us for a long time to come.
Well, I think what most disturbs me, and it's been alluded to before, is that the very real change in the perspectives of the American people and the Mexican people over the last 25 years, which have been in a very positive direction, eliminating the misconceptions and the biases of the past, allowing for greater levels of cooperation. I think it's really quite striking how fragile this really is. And we see it not only in Mexico, but in just the general posture in the rest of the world and the world's perception of the United States, that in a relatively short period of time we are losing our preeminence as the voice of democracy and liberty and rationality, so to speak. So I think, while everything that has been said I totally agree with, we will have a tremendous difficulty in rebuilding a level of confidence that had been growing and has proven to be quite easily shattered.
Well, I agree with both of my colleagues. I'm very worried about undermining the trust and confidence that we've built, and how easy it is to undermine that, and it takes a lot of hard work. It can be rebuilt, but it takes hard work in a variety of areas to do that. Particularly, I'm worried about the younger folk in Mexico, most of whom in my 4 years living there were enthused about the possibilities and very supportive of the vision of the United States and working with the United States. And I hope we can find a way to maintain and to rebuild that if it goes forward. And then secondly, I think more broadly, we need a vision and a plan to make America great. There are a lot of things that we need to fix in the United States. There's no question about that. But it's not just trade, it's not just NAFTA, it's doing a whole agenda of hard policy and programmatic ideas to address these problems. And that's hard work, and we're not really yet into that hard work, I think, and that is where I hope we can get out of the kind of discussion, debate we've had up until now. I hope we can get to what are the real items to address these problems.
Great. Well, I think this has been a fabulous discussion. Thanks to all the ambassadors here who have joined us. I think the main message here is all of us have to get out and do a lot of work in terms of educating the public about the strategic importance of the bilateral relationship with Mexico. We'll pass to a 5-minute break and then rejoin here shortly. Thank you.